Your Excellency, welcome to Euronews.
Thank you.
Now, about this hot topic of the day, that is the signing of the last stage of the association agreement between Ukraine and the EU, Russia has opposed to it really seriously and vociferously. Why?
Well, we are not actually opposed to any signing ceremony. Of course, every country, including Ukraine, has the sovereign right to conclude any agreement with any other foreign partner, be it the European Union or anybody else. The issue at stake is the impact of that association agreement onto traditional trade and economic links between Russia and Ukraine. Well, it's common knowledge that until say something 23 years ago, the Russian economy and the Ukrainian economy were parts of a single economy. And even today, the two economies are closely linked by industrial cooperation ties, by common standards, norms, and regulations, which in case Ukraine proceeds with implementing the association agreement with the European Union, it will have to change, thereby creating certain problems in its further relationship with, in the economic field, with my own country and also other countries, members of the Eurasian Economic Union.
Yes, but the association is going to be finalized. What do you want to do about it?
We are discussing currently, and actually today as we speak, there are ongoing consultations here in Brussels with, between the Russian Ministry of Economic Development and the relevant services of the European Commission on the impact of this association agreement on the Russian-Ukrainian economic ties. One can ask, of course, the question, the logical one, why these consultations are only happening now, a day before the signing of the economic part of the agreement. Well, we had been suggesting those consultations for some time. It was actually how the whole Ukrainian crisis erupted. It was when the Russian government outlined to the then Ukrainian government the concerns that we might have and the problems they might have as part of that impact. That was back in November of last year. And President Yanukovych of Ukraine then chose to postpone the signing to have a second look at what it's all about. Of course, we all know the subsequent events.
Yes, you're talking about the impact. What impact are you talking about?
Well, Ukraine is a fairly large country with heavy industries, primarily in the east, and also quite developed agricultural sector in the west and south and the center. One impact, which is easily discernible in the immediate future, would be that Ukrainian producers will have to shift to the norms and rules of the EU acquis in terms of production standards, veterinary and phytosanitary rules, and a lot of other things. That might limit their ability to export their goods to the European Union. Where would those products go? To the Russian market. Secondly, I've already referred to the numerous industrial cooperation ties. including in sectors as sensitive as the military industries. So it's, I would say, a very well-developed cooperation, but based on, shall I say, Soviet/Russian standards, production standards. If the Ukrainian enterprises switch to EU rules and norms, those ties will suffer. So there is no political hidden agenda in this. The whole issue is relates to the economic field.
To what extent do you need Ukrainian goods, and do you need this economic tie with Ukraine?
Well, of course, Russia is a country big enough to survive without without those goods, but it will take time. It will take additional investment. It will take money. The impact, of course, on the Ukrainian economy will be far greater.
Yes, but why should you bother?
Well, you know, we care about our brothers in Ukraine. That's why we, among other things, we continue to supply them with natural gas in spite of the fact that they are not paying anything for it.
Yes, but you see, the relationship will continue in so many ways, because your partners in the customs union, Kazakhstan and Belarus, they have said that they have absolutely no objections to the agreement, and that the Ukrainian goods would go to Russia via Kazakhstan and
well,
Belarus.
that issue will be regulated, of course, under the norms of the Eurasian Economic Union. But you know, today, Ukraine is a signatory of the CIS Free Trade Area Agreement. So our trade is free in terms of no custom duties are paid for anything. If Ukraine goes into association with the European Union, then we will be obliged to switch to the normal, non-preferential regime of MFN, much favored nation, which is normal for trade relations between most countries of the world. But Ukraine will no longer be able to count on preferential treatment.
Yes, you talked about Russia being big enough to survive without Ukrainian economic relationship. Also, in 1998, that is as far back as that, Russia and Ukraine signed a the EU and Ukraine signed a cooperation agreement to which you didn't object. So the question arises that why do you make such a hoo-ha over the association? And also there's a school of thought that says that the whole idea has become politicized in such a way to somehow justify the annexation of Crimea to the Russian territory.
Well, you're raising three questions in one. So the 1998 agreement was very much in line with the agreement that Russia itself signed with the European Union 4 years earlier in 1994. And actually, as we speak, on the 24th of June, we marked the 20th anniversary of that agreement, which was originally signed for a 10-year period, but automatically extended on an annual basis ever since, in anticipation of a new basic agreement, which we have been negotiating with the EU until the EU suspended those negotiations a few months ago. That's question number one. Question number two, politicized. We didn't politicize it. And it was never our intention. It was politicized by certain political forces in Ukraine. I can understand those young people in the early days of the Maidan protests. They thought that they had been on the threshold of the European Union, as if the association agreement meant that they would be joining the European Union. And most of them, and I have evidence to support that, most of them were convinced that the association agreement meant a visa-free regime for them, which was never the intention, never the case. So they had been indoctrinated by everybody, by the Ukrainian authorities of the time, the different governments, by the European Union, by the media, the NGOs, and everybody. So they had, I would say, a view of the association which was different from the real one. Now, your third question about Crimea. Of course, we didn't annex anything. It was the will expressed in a democratic procedure by the people of Crimea.
Disputed by the EU?
Disputed by the EU. Well, I'm sure there will come a moment when the EU and all those who have misgivings about that will understand the real significance of what happened. It happened. Well, I will give you my personal view. I think the people in Crimea lived a very uncomfortable life in Ukraine for many reasons. They tried to gain an autonomous status, and each time the central authorities in Crimea slashed their autonomy. You know, like liquidating the post of president of the autonomy and changing its constitution and so on. Secondly, they were neglected in the economic sense. You know, Crimea historically was a jewel in the crown of the Russian Empire.
Are we going back to that period?
I'm sure we are almost there. Well, with some additional investment, of course, because the state of the regional economy in Crimea is, I would say, not what it could have been, had the Ukrainian authorities been far-sighted enough to take care of the situation. Anyway, I wouldn't exclude that many people in Crimea are feeling uncomfortable, as I said. They were looking and waiting for an opportunity to change all this. And that opportunity arose when the February coup in Kiev took place, which was hardly legitimate. And there was an immediate danger, and there were actually public statements from certain radical groups and their leaders in Kiev that they would be sending squads of hardline fighters to take care of Crimea. Of course, the people down in the peninsula were frightened for their lives. So what they did was to organize a referendum and vote with a very strong majority in favor, first of independence, and then as an independent entity to join the Russian Federation. That's entirely what happened.
And what did Russia do to help them achieve that?
Well, the Russian parliament and the president took the necessary decisions to address their wish. If you are alluding to the military factor, okay, Russian military presence in Crimea has been there since the end of the 18th century. The naval base at Sevastopol was there since Catherine the Great. And recently, the legal basis for that was the Russian-Ukrainian agreements signed in 2010, which, among other things, stipulated for a ceiling of the numbers of military personnel present. Well, if I don't bore you with details, the ceiling was 25,000. And the actual numbers at the time when the crisis in Crimea, in Ukraine erupted, was 16,000. So the additional 9,000 were sent there to prop up the military presence, but within the legal limits of that agreement.
Your Excellency, one very important question, that is, are you afraid of NATO's presence in Ukraine?
Well, my country is not afraid of anything or anybody, but looking at the overall posture of those authorities that came to power through that coup in Kiev, of course we had to be concerned, because there were statements and practical steps which I would say could have resulted at some point in what you are referring to.
What if NATO starts a presence in Ukraine? What would you do?
In Ukraine, well, the Ukrainian constitution, to begin with, provides for neutrality. And I understand this...
It wouldn't interfere with their neutrality. They just allow bases for NATO.
Well, I hope they will be sensible enough to avoid that.
And if they don't?
If they don't, that would create additional problems in Russia-NATO relations and in Russia-Ukrainian relations.
Such as?
We will not go to war, but, you know, frankly, looking at NATO's reaction to all this, I cannot escape the feeling that NATO is quite happy with the developments. I attended a conference here in Brussels a few months ago, actually back in March, when, of course, the Ukrainian crisis was at its helm, and on the panel were 3 NATO secretaries general, the current one and his 2 predecessors. And the 3 of them looked quite happy, as if at last NATO has found a raison d'etre, post-Afghanistan raison d'etre. Because I have been following some of the discussions on the sidelines, of course, that concentrated on what NATO should be doing after it withdraws from Afghanistan. They sort of were shopping for a mission. And now, as a gift of God, with the active help of individual NATO member states who are, you know, feeling very agitated about whatever Russia is doing, they found, or actually they found a way to address this issue of NATO's existence in the post-Afghanistan period.
Right, so if you mentioned you're not going to go to into war with them, but does it mean that perhaps it would take us all back to the era of Cold War?
You know, this talk about a Cold War too, I think is misplaced. The Cold War as a phenomenon was primarily an ideological standoff of 2 completely different ideologies, which, of course, were feeding practical policies in the diplomatic field and also in the military field. But the essence was this incompatibility of the 2 ideologies. It's no longer there. I don't see any problem between Russia and the West that cannot be solved by diplomatic means through negotiations. Of course, the harsh rhetoric that we are hearing these days is not helpful, naturally. But I'm optimistic. I'm a born optimist. That's why I've chosen this profession. So I hope that reason will prevail.
Your Excellency, thank you.
Thank you.